You came here for a monster. We always do. We picture something in the dark. Fangs, a snarl, a face that announces what it is. That picture is a comfort, and it's the first lie this story will tell you. The most dangerous man you'll meet has soft hands and a steady signature. There's a diploma on his wall and a stethoscope around his neck. He's punctual. He's courteous to the nurses, remembers their birthdays. And when his shift ends, he drives home through ordinary traffic, kisses his wife, helps a child with fractions, and falls asleep without trouble, after a day spent deciding who would live and who would not. In 1961, Hannah Arendt traveled to Jerusalem to watch Adolf Eichmann, the man who scheduled the trains to the death camps, stand trial behind a wall of bulletproof glass. She arrived braced for a fiend. What she found disturbed her far more. A balding, mild-mannered functionary who fussed over procedure and seemed proudest of having done his job well. From that courtroom, she pulled a phrase the world has never shaken loose: the banality of evil. The horror was not that a demon had done this. It was that a profoundly ordinary man had felt nothing while doing it. So, set aside the creature in the fog. The men in this story passed their inspections. They published in respected journals. They drew steady government paychecks. And many of them, this is the part that should keep you awake, believed to their bones that they were healers, which leaves the one question worth the next hour of your life. If the killer isn't a monster, what turns a doctor into an executioner? The killing never starts with a weapon. It starts with a list. Before a single life is taken, someone sits at a desk, draws a line, and decides which people belong on the wrong side of it. In Nazi Germany, the language was cold and clinical. Lebensunwertes Leben, life unworthy of life, and useless eaters. Under the program, later codenamed Action T4, the regime didn't begin with the Jews of Europe. It began at home, with its own. The disabled, the mentally ill, the incurably sick, German children carried out of asylums and gassed in rooms disguised as showers, while their mothers and fathers received a tidy letter explaining the patient had died, regrettably, of pneumonia. Now the part that should turn your stomach. None of this was a German invention. The scaffolding was built in the polite democracies first. In 1927, the United States Supreme Court ruled it entirely lawful to forcibly sterilize a young woman named Carrie Buck, guilty of nothing but being poor and labeled feeble-minded. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the most admired jurists in American history, wrote the verdict out loud. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. More than 60,000 Americans were sterilized on home soil. German lawyers read those opinions and took careful notes. And it isn't ancient history. In Peru, between 1996 and 2000, Alberto Fujimori's government sterilized an estimated 270,000 people, overwhelmingly poor, indigenous Quechua women, many who never consented, some who never even knew. It was marketed as public health. The condemned class is always drawn up by someone certain he's being reasonable. That's the trap. The list is never written by villains. It's written by men who believe they are being kind. They never call it murder. They call it medicine. That single swap is the engine of every atrocity in this film. A regime can't simply order thousands of doctors, nurses, and clerks to become killers. Most people flinch at that. So it offers them something far more flattering: the role of healer. The nation gets reimagined as one living body. The condemned class stops being people and becomes a growth, an infection, a poison in the blood. And just like that, the worst thing a human being can do is rebranded as surgery. Necessary, sterile, even merciful. The Nazis had a word for it: Rassenhygiene, racial hygiene. Not hatred, hygiene. The vocabulary of the clinic and the scrub sink. Mass murder, dressed in a white coat, smelling faintly of disinfectant. And here's the second turn. The one that should bother anyone who assumes this kind of evil only happens over there. The idea wasn't born in Berlin. It was built in the polite democracies first. American eugenics came decades earlier, bankrolled by respected philanthropic foundations, taught in Ivy League lecture halls, exported in textbooks and journals across the Atlantic with total scientific confidence. The civilized world drafted the blueprint. Germany simply read it to the end. That's what makes the cure ideology so durable. To the man carrying it out, it never feels like cruelty. It feels like duty. It feels like progress. The doctor doesn't think I am killing a child. He thinks I am protecting the future. The clerk doesn't think I am signing a death warrant. He thinks I am improving the species. Give a man a noble enough story, and he will do unspeakable things and sleep like a baby. But a story is only words. Somewhere, a real person had to pick up the knife. We keep waiting for the moment, the threshold, the flash of corruption, the instant a good man turns. It almost never comes. That's the trick of it. Nobody who helped build a death factory woke up one morning and chose to be a monster. They arrived one small, reasonable step at a time. In 1961, the psychologist Stanley Milgram sat ordinary people in front of a dial and told them to deliver what they believed were rising electric shocks to a stranger in the next room. When they hesitated, a calm man in a lab coat said only, "Please continue." Most of them did. Past the screams, past the silence, to the very end of the board. Not monsters. Volunteers who trusted the man in the coat. That is the staircase, and Nazi Germany built it in daylight. First, forced sterilization, unsettling but wrapped in the language of science. Then, Action T4, the mercy killing of the disabled, where the first purpose-built gas chambers were tested. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. When T4 was publicly shut down, its staff weren't punished. They were promoted, shipped east with the same gas technology to build the death camps. The murder of disabled Germans was the rehearsal. The Holocaust was opening night. The psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton interviewed those men years later and named what kept them sane: doubling. The healer and the killer lived in one body, in separate rooms, neither looking at the other's hands. It doesn't always wear a uniform. In Alabama, the Tuskegee study began in 1932 with something gentler, just watching untreated syphilis in 399 black men, then watching for 40 years, long after the cure sat on the shelf. The first cut is never the deep one. Every legend needs a cover story. A frightened town might invent a ghost to explain the bodies. A state builds something stronger and quieter. A vocabulary. And here's the twist almost no one catches. The euphemisms aren't mainly there to fool the victims. They're there to protect the killers. A man can't meet his own eyes after a day of murder. But after a day of special treatment, after processing a resettlement, after administering therapy, that he can carry home. The gentle word is an anesthetic for the executioner's conscience. So listen to the language. It's always the tell. The Nazis didn't say kill. They said Sonderbehandlung, special handling. They didn't say ship to their deaths. They said resettlement to the east, a genocide narrated in the soothing cadence of a travel itinerary. The Soviets refined a subtler version. How do you cage a sane man for disagreeing with the party without admitting you hold political prisoners? You invent an illness. At Moscow's Serbsky Institute, the psychiatrist Andrei Snezhnevsky gave the regime a diagnosis tailored for the job: sluggish schizophrenia, a disease whose chief symptom, conveniently, was dissent. Criticize the state, and you weren't a critic. You were a patient. The asylum became the prison, and the prison wore a lab coat. And in America, the cover story sat in plain view, printed in medical journals for anyone to read: the study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. It sounded like science. It was a death sentence with a footnote. That's the genius and the rot of it. The most chilling words here aren't the violent ones. They're the calm, clinical ones. The words that let everyone pretend nothing is wrong. But a lie this size has to be fed. And its appetite only grows. Here's the law of the machine, and nothing in this story ever breaks it. A system built to harm comes with an accelerator and no brake. The reason is mechanical, not moral. Once the killing has schedules, quotas, supply chains, and salaries attached, It stops being an event and becomes a process. And a process doesn't stop to ask whether it should go on. It does what every process does. It streamlines, it scales, it hunts for efficiencies. Watch the boundaries creep. Action T4 opened with the most severely disabled. But the criteria were elastic by design, and they stretched. To the chronically ill, to the asocial, to anyone an overworked official could file as a burden. The net never tightens. It only widens, because a bureaucracy measures itself by throughput. In occupied Manchuria, Japan's Unit 731, under Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, didn't merely experiment on people, it industrialized it. Prisoners were infected with plague, anthrax, and cholera. They were operated on while still alive, often without anesthesia, and the results were logged with the cold precision of a lab report. In the records, the victims weren't even granted the word people. They were called maruta, logs, timber for the mill, and the operation only swelled, only grew hungrier, bending disease into a weapon, because nothing inside it was ever built to say stop. That's the engine you're watching. It doesn't feel guilt, it feels momentum. Every horror becomes the new normal, and the new normal demands a fresh one to still feel like progress. A machine like that never halts itself. The break always comes from outside. We keep asking, how could they? The sharper question, the one that turns the whole thing inside out, is who got paid? A state crime isn't an accident, it's an arrangement, and everyone inside it is collecting something. The currency isn't always cash. Sometimes it's a promotion. Sometimes it's the breakthrough that makes a career, the paper that makes a name. Sometimes it's just the quiet safety of going along while the risk sits on someone else's desk. The social psychologists Herbert Kellman and V. Lee Hamilton laid out the recipe in their study of crimes of obedience. Authorization. An authority makes it official, so the choice isn't yours. Routinization. It becomes a job with procedures, so you stop thinking. Dehumanization. The victim becomes a number, a case file, a log, so there's no one left to pity. And here's the structural twist that links every regime in this film. The machine is built so no single person ever feels responsible. The man who writes the policy never sees a body. The man who sees the body is only following policy. Guilt gets spread across so many desks it simply evaporates. The sociologist Zygmunt Bauman put it bluntly, the Holocaust wasn't bureaucracy breaking down. It was bureaucracy working exactly as designed, with conscience quietly removed from the assembly line. Sometimes the prophet is naked. In apartheid South Africa, a secret program called Project Coast, run by a cardiologist the press would dub Dr. Death, Wouter Basson, pursued ways to suppress black fertility and built poisons for the regime's enemies, buried under front companies. In America, the CIA's MKUltra paid doctors to drug unwitting citizens in the name of security. By every internal logic, the machine should run forever. And yet, every one of these machines, armed with budgets and secret police and the full weight of the state, was brought down by a single human being. Usually, one nobody had ever heard of. Sit with how absurd that is. An apparatus that crushed millions, undone by one clerk who couldn't sleep, or one priest who wouldn't stay quiet. In the United States, the Tuskegee study ran for 40 years without a pause. It ended because a young public health service investigator named Peter Buxton couldn't carry what he knew. He raised it inside the system and was brushed off, for years. So he took it to a journalist, and in July 1972, a reporter named Jean Heller put it on the front page. The outrage that followed, not the doctors, not the government, shut it down in months. In Nazi Germany, at the very height of the regime's power, one voice cracked the silence over Action T4. In August 1941, Bishop Clemens von Galen climbed into a pulpit in Münster and denounced the murder of the disabled out loud, from the altar by name. His sermons were copied by hand and passed from stranger to stranger across the country. The uproar grew loud enough that the regime officially halted the program. One man, one sermon. against the entire machinery of the Reich. And in the Soviet Union, the abuse of psychiatry was dragged into the light, not by the state, but by the dissidents it tried to erase, smuggling out testimony until, in 1977, the World Psychiatric Association formally condemned it. The lesson is the hardest in the film. The break is never internal. A person supplies the conscience the system lacks, and usually pays for it first. So the truth comes out. Surely now comes justice. We want the ending we were promised, the trial, the verdict. The men who turned medicine into murder, finally made to answer. And now and then, just often enough to keep us believing, we get a fragment of it. After the war, the world convened the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, 1946 to 1947. 23 defendants, 16 convicted, 7 hanged. And out of that courtroom came something genuinely good and lasting. The Nuremberg Code, the founding charter of medical ethics, built on one radical sentence: no human being may be experimented on without consent. Then comes the twist that poisons the victory. At nearly the same moment the world was hanging Nazi doctors for human experimentation, it was quietly cutting a deal with the Japanese ones who'd done the same. The architects of Unit 731, the men who infected and froze and cut open living people, were never tried. The United States handed them immunity in exchange for their research. The plague data bought their freedom. Justice and the files were set on a scale, and the files won. The pattern repeats wherever you look. Dr. Death, Wouter Basson, stood trial in South Africa and walked. Acquitted in 2002, his medical license intact for years after. The men of Tuskegee waited until 1997, a quarter-century past exposure, for a U.S. president to say sorry. The Guatemala experiments, where doctors deliberately infected the unsuspecting in the late 1940s, stayed buried until the historian Susan Reverby unearthed them in 2010. And only then did the apology come. And in every reckoning, notice who's missing. The victims. Counted, never named. A statistic in a verdict, a line in a settlement. The doctors got their defense and their dignity. The dead got a footnote. Justice, it turns out, was a transaction. So the powerful are left with one last move. Not to bury the crime, to use it. And that's the darkest turn of all. The truth is the final victim, and it dies twice. The first death is denial. The file is closed, the records burned, the past quietly rewritten. Japan spent decades shrinking Unit 731 down to a rumor. The Soviet Union denied its psychiatric abuses until the Union itself stopped existing. Power's first instinct is to make the crime vanish. It never happened. It wasn't so bad. It was long ago, let it rest. The second death is gentler, and we all take part in it. When the denial finally fails, the story isn't honored, it's repackaged. It becomes content. A lurid thumbnail, a breathless narration, a villain so grotesque he lets the audience feel safe, because surely we never could. And the victims are flattened all over again, shrunk to a body count built to make you gasp. Their names still missing, their humanity sanded down until only the horror is left to sell. Both versions commit the same quiet murder. One says it didn't happen. The other says it happened to someone unimaginable, far away, long ago. Both let you sleep. And that is why this exists. The condemned class, the cure dressed as medicine, the soft euphemisms, the staircase of small steps, the guilt spread thin, the machine with no break. None of it is behind glass in a museum. It's a checklist. And somewhere, right now, it is running, narrated in calm, reasonable words, by people certain they are being kind. You came looking for a monster in the fog. But the monster was always the distraction, the one man a system points to so it can walk away clean. So carry the only question that ever mattered: who is harvesting whom, and how much of it will you recognize the next time it begins?